The October sky over Nashville hung low and gray, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just threatened all day long. A thin wind moved through the construction site on George Street, carrying the smell of wet concrete, sawdust, and someone's fast food from half a block away. The city hummed below, delivery trucks, a distant car horn, the irregular percussion of pneumatic drills from the site next door, a soundtrack that Clay Harmon had grown so used to over the years that silence, when it came, felt wrong. He was 48 years old, and he was 40 feet off the ground. The scaffold swayed slightly as he shifted his weight, troweling hand smoothing a fresh layer of mortar between two courses of brick with the automatic precision of a man who has done something so many times it no longer requires thought. His hands moved on their own. They always did it. That was the thing about masonry that nobody told you when you were young and stupid and thought laying brick was something you did while you figured out what you actually wanted to do with your life. Eventually, the work got into your hands so deep that your brain could just leave, go somewhere else. And Clay's brain, left to its own devices, almost always went to the same place. Music. Not music in the abstract. Specific songs. Specific memories attached to specific songs, the way smell attaches to memory. Sudden and total and a little cruel. He'd be smoothing mortar, and suddenly he'd be 19 again, standing in the back room of a bar in Brentwood with a borrowed guitar and a belly full of nerves, about to go on stage for the first time. Or he'd be 23, hunched over a spiral notebook at the kitchen table in the apartment he shared with two other guys in East Nashville, scratching out lyrics with a golf pencil because he'd run out of real ones. Or he'd be 26 and sitting in a producer's office, off Music Row, and the man behind the desk would be saying words that even now, 22 years later, Clay could reproduce syllable by syllable in his head. You've got something, Harmon. I won't lie to you about that. But something isn't everything. He pressed the trowel flat against the brick and sank. He didn't plan to. He never planned to. It just happened the way breathing happened. His lungs filled with October air, and what came out, low and a little rough, was melody. Easy come, easy go. His voice was a working man's voice now. Time and cigarettes. He'd quit 7 years ago, but the damage was the permanent kind, and years of raising it over construction noise had stripped it of whatever smoothness it once had, and replaced that smoothness with something raw, more honestly, wood that's been sanded down to the grain. He wasn't performing. There was no one to perform for. He was just singing the way a man talks to himself when the silence gets too heavy, she said as she walked out the door. 40 feet below, the George Street moved through its ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A city bus whizzed past. A woman in a yellow raincoat walked a small dog that seemed deeply suspicious of a trash can. A construction foreman named Pete Alvarez stood by the site office trailer, checking something on his clipboard with a mildly aggravated expression. He wore as a default setting, and a black Ford F-250 with Texas plates rolled slowly up the street and stopped. Not stopped at a light. The light was green. Just stopped. The driver's side window was already down. The man behind the wheel, somewhere in his early 70s, silver-haired beneath a worn resistal hat, wearing a plain blue shirt, had his left elbow resting on the window frame and his head tilted slightly back, the way you tilt your head when you're really listening to something. Not half listening. Not listening while also thinking about something else. Actually listening. Clay didn't see him. Clay was facing the brick wall. Trow-moving voice carrying down through the gray October air. I knew right then that I was not the one. A car behind the F-250 honked. The silver-haired man didn't move. She had places to go and things to get done. Pete Alvarez looked up from his clipboard at the honking. He looked at the stopped truck. He squinted. He took a step forward, then stopped, tilting his own head now, wearing an expression that said he was either seeing what he thought he was seeing or he needed to get his eyes checked. Clay kept singing. He sang through the second verse. voice catching slightly on the word darlin' the way it always did. The way it had caught on that same word the first time he'd sung this song out loud, alone in his pickup truck on I-40 at age when he'd first heard it on the radio and felt like someone had reached into his chest and rearranged things. He sang through the chorus again, unhurried, unself-conscious. A man alone with a wall and a trowel and a song, he sang it to the end. The last note dissolved into the gray air. Clay exhaled, dragged his forearm across his forehead, and reached for his water bottle. Below him, he heard Pete's voice. Pete, who was not a man given to exclamation, say with considerable feeling, "Son of A." And then another voice, coming from street level, from the direction of a black truck with Texas plates, a voice Clay Harmon had heard on the radio for 30 years. "You know," the voice said, conversational and the way men talk in no particular rush. "I've heard a lot of people sing that song." Clay turned around on the scaffold. He turned too fast, and the platform swayed, and he grabbed the safety rail with one hand. And his water bottle hit the scaffold planking and rolled toward the edge, and he watched it fall 40 feet to the sidewalk below. He didn't watch where it landed. He was looking at the man in the truck. George Strait looked up at him with an expression that was calm and faintly amused and completely, unmistakably real. "Take your time up there," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Clay came down from the scaffold with the careful deliberateness of a man whose legs had developed an unexpected and inconvenient instability. He was aware, in a distant, slightly panicked way, that his palms were sweating inside his work gloves, which struck him as absurd. He'd been 40 feet in the air for 6 hours, and his palms hadn't sweated once. He pulled the gloves off as he descended the last ladder section and dropped to street level and stood on the sidewalk, and George Strait was standing maybe 8 feet away, leaning against the front of the F-250 with his arms loosely crossed, watching Clay with the patient attentiveness of a man who had learned, over a long life, not to rush important moments. He looked exactly like himself. That was the first thing Clay's brain produced, which was not a useful thought, but was apparently the only thought available at the moment. He'd half expected the man to look diminished in person, the way famous people sometimes did, smaller, somehow, than the version of them that lived inside your head. George Strait did not look diminished. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent decades being completely, uncomplicatedly himself, and who wore that consistency the way he wore that hat, without apparent effort. "Clay Harmon," Clay said, because saying his own name seemed like a reasonable thing to do. He offered his hand, remembered it had mortar on it, started to pull it back. George Strait shook it anyway. "George Strait," he said, as though Clay might not have known. "I know," Clay said. "I figured." The faint smile. "You were singing my song." Yeah." Clay looked at his own hand. "Now free. I've been singing your songs for 30 years. I apologize for the quality of what you just heard." "I don't think you need to apologize for that," George Strait said. He uncrossed his arms and looked up at the scaffold, then back at Clay. "How long you been doing this work?" "Mason," Clay calculated the way you calculate something. "That adds up to more than you expected. 20 years. Give or take. You like it?" The question landed with more weight than it had any right to have. Clay considered the honest answer for a moment, which he almost never did with that particular question. Most people who asked it were asking something else. "Are you okay? Have you made peace with it?" And he'd gotten very good at answering the something else instead of the question. "I'm good at it," he said. George Strait nodded as if that answered something. "You eat yet today?" Clay blinked. "What? Lunch?" "You eat." Clay thought about the granola bar he'd had at 10 and the fact that it was now nearly 3 in the afternoon. "No. There's a place to blocks up makes a brisket sandwich that's about as good as it gets in this state. Buy you lunch, if you don't mind sitting with a stranger." Clay Harmon stood on the sidewalk on DeMonbrun Street in the city of Nashville, Tennessee, covered in mortared dust and wearing work boots that had seen considerably better days, and looked at George Strait and tried to locate a reasonable response somewhere in his brain. "Pete," he called. without taking his eyes off the man in front of him. Pete Alvarez, who had been standing stock still by the site trailer, watching this interaction with the expression of a man who believed he might be experiencing a medical event, straightened. "Yeah, I'm taking my lunch." Pete stared at him. Then he stared at George Strait. Then he stared at Clay again. "It's 3 o'clock. I know what time it is." A pause. Then Pete Alvarez, a man of tremendous practical reserve, nodded once. "Take your time," he said. The place was called Denny's Smokehouse, though the sign out front only said Denny's, because the smokehouse part had been missing for years and nobody had gotten around to replacing it, which Pete always claimed said everything you needed to know about the level of ambition involved in a place that was just going to be good without any effort at marketing. They took a booth near the back. The woman who brought their menus recognized George Strait, went very still for a moment, and then composed herself with admirable professionalism and asked if they wanted anything to drink. "Just water," George Strait said. "Same," Clay said. "When she left you." George Strait put his hat on the seat beside him and ran a hand through his silver hair and looked at Clay with the level, undemanding attention of a man who had made a career of paying attention to things. "So," he said, "Nashville native?" "No, sir." Clay wrapped both hands around his water glass. "Tulsa, originally. Came out here when I was 21 to do masonry." Clay smiled at the table. "To make music, silenced. The comfortable kind that some men know how to create just by not filling it with noise." George Strait waited. "Played guitar," Clay said. "Wrote songs. Did the whole thing, open mics, showcases, sending demos to people who never called back. Drove a delivery truck during the day. Played bars at night. Did that for about 5 years before he stopped, found the end of the sentence and decided it was accurate enough. Before I stopped. What happened?" Clay looked up. The question was direct, without being invasive. Genuinely curious. The way man asks when he actually wants to know and isn't just being polite. "A lot of things," Clay said. "All at once. The kind of a lot of things that adds up to." It didn't work out. He turned the water glass slowly on the table. "Got married. Wife. She wanted something more solid. Couldn't argue with her." "Really?" "We had a daughter on the way. I had an offer to go in as a partner in a masonry business with a guy I knew from the delivery job. Danny Kowalski. Good money. Steady work." He shrugged, and the shrug contained 22 years. Seemed like the right call. Was it? The masonry part was, he said it without self-pity, which took more effort than it looked. The partnership wasn't. Danny turned out to have ideas about finances that differed from mine. Specifically, he thought they were his, and I thought they were ours. He picked up his water glass, set it down again. Took me 6 years and everything I'd saved to find out who was right. He was, about the finances being his. I mean, he'd made sure of that. George Strait was quiet for a moment. And the wife, divorced by the time the business thing finished falling apart, she wasn't. It wasn't about the money. That was just the last thing. Clay shook his head slightly. "Carol, she was a good woman. She deserved better than a man who was always halfway somewhere else in his head. You know what I mean?" "I think most musicians know what you mean," George Strait said. Their food arrived. The brisket sandwiches were, as advertised, exceptional. They ate in the comfortable silence of two men who had nothing in particular to prove to each other, which struck Clay later, thinking about it, as the strangest part of the whole encounter, how immediately unperformative it had been. He wasn't trying to impress the man across from him. He wasn't telling his story for effect. He was just telling it the way you tell things to someone you've somehow known longer than you've actually known them. "You have a daughter?" George Strait said eventually. "Renee." Clay said her name carefully, the way you say the name of something that can hurt you. 24, lives in Memphis, works in hospital administration. He paused. "We don't talk much. Whose call was that?" Clay was quiet for a moment. "Outside, a truck passed on Demon Brune, sending a brief vibration through the booth. Mine, originally," he said. Hers! Now! He picked up his sandwich, put it down. I wasn't around enough when she was growing up. Work. And then the whole business disaster. And I had reasons. At the time, they seemed like explanations. Looking back, they seem more like excuses. He exhaled. She stopped calling about 2 years ago. I call sometimes. She picks up. We talk about nothing for 5 minutes. She says she has to go. I say, okay. He looked at the window. It is what it is. Is that what you think? Clay turned back. George Strait was looking at him with that same level of attention. No judgment in it, just the question. No, Clay said after a moment. No, I guess I don't think that. They sat in that booth for an hour and 40 minutes. George Strait paid for the sandwiches over Clay's objection, doing so with the ease of a man for whom the gesture was habitual rather than ostentatious. They talked about music, about the architecture of a good country song, about the difference between a voice that's technically perfect and a voice that makes you feel something, about songs that stay with you and why. They talked about work, real work, hands in the material work, and George Strait had a genuine interest in the craft of masonry that surprised Clay until he remembered that the man had grown up on a ranch in Texas and knew what it meant to work at something physical and demanding until you got good at it. They did not talk about what George Strait was doing in Nashville or why he'd stopped his truck on Demon Street. Those things felt, somehow, beside the point. When they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the gray sky had made up its mind, and a light rain was starting to fall, and the city smelled like wet asphalt in autumn. And George Strait put his resistor back on and pulled out his phone. "Give me your number," he said. Clay stared at him. "I'm in town through the weekend," George Strait said. "I'd like to hear more of your songs, the ones you wrote. I mean, you write them down anywhere? Or is it all up here?" He tapped his temple. "They are notebooks," Clay said, with a stunned expression of a man who can't quite locate the reality he was living in 30 seconds ago. "Old ones? From before. Bring one," George Strait said simply. "Saturday, I'll text you the address." Clay gave him his number. They shook hands again. George Strait got in the F250 and pulled out into traffic, and Clay stood on the sidewalk in the October rain and watched the truck until it turned onto a side street and disappeared. He stood there for another 30 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and called Pete Alvarez. "Pete," he said, when Pete picked up. "What did you see today?" A pause. "I saw what I saw." "Clay?" "Yeah." He looked down the empty street. "Two." That night, Clay Harmon sat on the edge of his bed in the small apartment he rented on Gallatin Pike. 2 rooms, a kitchen that was generous only by the standards of a man who rarely cooked, a bathroom with a shower head that had committed to only 2 settings, scalding or frigid, and held a cardboard box on his lap. He hadn't opened this box in 3 years. He knew this because the last time he'd opened it had been the night before Renee's 21st birthday, when he'd gotten the idea that he would find the cassette tape of the first song he'd ever recorded, a battered 4-track recording from 1998. His voice, at 20, raw and optimistic, in the way that only people who don't yet know what's coming to them can sound and copy it to digital, somehow, and send it to her as a birthday message. He'd opened the box, found the tape, held it for 20 minutes, and put the box away without sending anything. He opened it now. The box smelled like dust and like another time. There were 6 spiral notebooks, various sizes. The pages swelled slightly with age. There was the cassette tape. There was a photograph he hadn't looked at deliberately in years. Himself at 23, standing in front of the old Bluebird Cafe before they'd moved it, guitar case in one hand. Grinning like a man who has recently been told that the future is wide open. He looked, in the photograph, both exactly like himself and nothing like himself. Same jaw, same eyes, same slight forward lean that his body defaulted to. But the grin, he couldn't locate that grin anymore. Couldn't remember precisely where he'd left it. He set the photograph aside and picked up the oldest notebook. The handwriting inside was not quite his. Tighter, somehow. more urgent. Page after page of it, lyrics, chord progressions, marked with letter names, little arrows where a melody rose or fell, fragments that had become songs and fragments that had just remained fragments. He read the words the way you read something written in a language you once spoke and have since have, recognizing more than you expected, stumbling on things you'd thought you'd lost. One page in particular stopped him. The song was called The Long Way Down. He didn't remember writing it, which was strange because the handwriting was definitely his and the date in the corner, March 4th, 2001, put him at 25, not so long before everything had shifted. But the lyrics were unfamiliar in the specific way of something you made when you were someone slightly different and then put away so thoroughly that it stopped being yours. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time, moving his lips slightly. Then he sat in the quiet of his apartment on Gallatin Pike, with the city sounds coming through the window and the photograph of his self lying face up on the bedspread beside him. And he felt something move inside his chest that he could only describe later, and only to himself, as a door. Not a door opening. Not yet, but a door, and a distant vertiginous awareness that the door had a handle. He closed the notebook, put the box on the floor beside the bed, and lay back on the mattress with his forearm over his eyes. Outside, Nashville went on being Nashville, indifferent and electric and loud. Clay Harmon stared at the inside of his own arm and thought about Saturday. The text came Thursday morning, just past 7, while Clay was pulling on his work boots by the door and half listening to the weather report from the radio on the kitchen counter. 60% chance of rain, becoming more certain as the week progressed, which was the weather in Nashville's way of saying yes, definitely rain. We just want you to feel like you had warning. The address was in Belle Meade. Clay knew Belle Meade the way working class Nashville knew Belle Meade. From the outside, respectfully, it was the kind of neighborhood where the houses didn't sit close to the street, where the trees were old and confident, where you could tell that money had been there long enough to stop being surprised at itself. The text was brief. An address, a time Saturday, 1 p.m., and one line. Bring the notebook. Clay stared at the text for long enough that he was late leaving for the site. Pete Alvarez noticed Clay's distraction with the resigned patience of a man who had been noticing Clay's distraction. In various forms, for 11 years, Pete was 53, built like a man who had spent decades arguing with gravity and mostly won, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent thoughtfulness by 20 years of outdoor work. He'd come up from San Antonio at 28 and never gone back, which he explained by saying that Nashville had taken everything he had to give, and San Antonio had accepted the loss philosophically. He was the closest thing Clay had to a best friend, which said something about the narrowness of Clay's social world, but said more about the quality of Pete Alvarez. "You're mixing too wet," Pete said, appearing behind Clay's left shoulder at 10:30. Clay looked at the mortar in the trough. Pete was right. "I'm thinking," Clay said. "I know. You've been thinking since Monday." Pete crouched down, picked up a margin trowel, checked the consistency of the mix with the professional intimacy of a doctor taking a pulse. "George Strait texted you." It wasn't a question. Clay had told Pete on Tuesday, standing in the rain on Demont Brune Street, both of them drenched before they'd thought to move. And Pete had listened to the whole account with the careful attention of a man filing things in the proper mental categories. He hadn't been excited. Exactly. He'd been interested, which from Pete was more meaningful than excitement. "He wants to hear my songs," Clay said. He was still slightly unable to say this sentence without an internal lurch. "Which songs?" "The old ones. The ones from before." He gestured vaguely toward 22 years ago. "He wants me to bring a notebook." Pete was quiet for a moment, working the trowel through the mortar. "You going to?" "I don't know." Pete stood up. He was not a man who wasted words, but he had a particular way of standing. When he had something direct to say, he squared his shoulders slightly, the way a man squares himself to a load he's about to lift. "Clay," he said, "I know. You haven't sung anything outside of a construction site in 20. I know. Pete, years. And a man who knows what he's talking about heard you through a truck window at 40 feet and invited you to his house. I'm aware." So what is there to not know? Pete looked at him with the level exasperation of a man who has watched another man be afraid of things for a long time and has grown tired of being indirect about it. You're scared. Clay picked up his trowel. I've got a Saturday job. The Dennison house. I'll cover the Dennison house. It's your weekend, Pete. I know whose weekend it is. Pete picked up his own tools. Go to Belmead. Clay! Bring the damn notebook. Friday night. Clay called his daughter. He called her the way he always called her, sitting at the kitchen table with the phone face up in front of him for 5 minutes beforehand, which was his way of building up to it, without admitting he was building up to it. He had her contact listed simply as Renee. No additional identifier, because she was the only person in his life to whom her first name alone was sufficient, and also because adding something, like daughter, after it seemed either sentimental or accusatory, he could never decide which. She answered on the 4th ring, which was better than the 5th or 6th, which was better than voicemail, which was where they'd been for about 4 months, the year before last. Hey, Dad! The voice was careful, not cold, careful. The voice you use when you've decided to try, and you're not going to let your guard down about it, but you're going to try. Hey, Renee! He heard something in the background. The TV? Maybe? Or music? You busy? Not really. Just got home. A beat. How are you? Good. Working on a building on de Montbrun. He paused. How's the hospital? Crazy. Budget review season. Lots of meetings. The careful voice, picking its way across the conversation. You sound different. Clay looked at the kitchen table. Something weird happened this week. A pause. Weird how? I was on the scaffold Tuesday. I was seeing. I do that sometimes. Up there, just to myself. I know you do that. Something shifted slightly in her voice when she said it. Something he couldn't fully read. George Strait was driving down the street. The silence that followed was long enough to be expressive. Georgie Strait, she said, finally. The George Strait. That's the one! He heard you singing. He stopped his truck. Heard the whole song. Took me to lunch. Another silence. Dad. Her voice had moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere that sounded almost like amusement, or wanted to be. That's actually insane. I know. What did you talk about? Music. Mostly. Work? He paused. You? A little quiet on the line. He could feel the shift in it. The careful weight she placed on the next question. What about me? I told him we didn't talk much. He was going to stop there, but then didn't. I told him it was my fault. Originally, the silence was different now. Fool her, Dad. I'm not calling to have that conversation tonight. I just wanted to tell you about the George Strait thing. It felt like something you'd want to know. She was quiet for a moment. He heard her moving, the sound of something being set down. Maybe a glass. He invited you to his house, she said. It wasn't a question. Saturday. He wants to hear the songs. Clay turned his coffee cup on the table. The old ones. You have them? Real surprise in her voice now. The notebooks. They were in that box. You remember the box? I remember the box. Quietly. The way you say a thing that carries more than the sentence itself. They were quiet together for a moment, and it was the most comfortable the silence between them had been in 2 years. Go, Dad, Renee said. Go, Saturday, da. Her voice had lost the careful quality. Just for a moment. Just briefly. Go. He said he would. They talked for another 10 minutes. Nothing important. Nothing difficult. Just words filling space in a way that felt, for once, like the right amount rather than too little. When she said she had to go, he said okay, and for once the okay was genuine rather than resigned. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. Then he got up, got the box from beside the bed, and spent the next 2 hours at the table with all 6 notebooks open, reading through 22 years of himself, Belle Mead on a Saturday afternoon in October was exactly what Clay had imagined it to be, which was large and quiet and full of trees that had been there long enough to have opinions about things. He drove out in his pickup, a 2009 Silverado, that ran fine but wore its age in the body panels, which were doing an honest job of recording every parking lot encounter and minor miscalculation of the last decade, and found the address, which turned out to be a house that was substantial without being ostentatious, set back from the road behind a long gravel drive lined with cedar trees. He sat in the truck at the end of the driveway for a full minute before pulling in. The door was answered by a woman who introduced herself as Linda, George Strait's wife, and who shook Clay's hand with the warm directness of someone who had spent decades being the person who put other people at ease, and who was very good at it. She led him through a house that felt actually lived in boots by the door, a dog that needed briefly acknowledging, framed photographs that were personal rather than decorative, and out through the back to a wide porch that looked out over a lawn fading to gold in the October light. George Strait was sitting in one of two chairs with a guitar on his knee. Not playing, just holding it, the way a man holds something familiar when he's thinking. He looked up when Clay came out and did that small, characteristic thing with his face that constituted a smile, contained and genuine. Nothing performed about it. "Clay," he said, "sit down. You want coffee?" "Linda makes, I'm fine," Clay said. He sat in the other chair. He had the notebook in his left hand, the oldest one, the one with the long way down and 43 other songs in his own tithe, urgent handwriting from a time when the future had still seemed directional. "Good drive over?" "Yes, sir." George Strait's eyes went to the notebook. "That the one?" Clay held it out. George Strait took it the way you take something you recognize as being significant carefully, without drama, but with a specific quality of attention. He opened it to the first page and read. Clay watched him read, which was uncomfortable in the way that watching anyone read your private writing is uncomfortable. The discomfort of having to remove the distance between what you actually felt and what anyone can see. George Strait read for several minutes without speaking. He turned pages slowly. Clay watched a cedar tree at the edge of the lawn move in a small wind and pretended he wasn't watching George Strait's face for reactions. Eventually, George Strait looked up. "Tell me about this one," he said, and turned the notebook so Clay could see the page. "The Long Way Down." "Yeah, I wrote it in 2001. Clay leaned forward slightly, hands between his knees. "After my dad died, we went close. My dad and me. He worked his whole life at a machine shop in Tulsa, and he never talked about what he wanted. You know, I never once heard my father say he wanted anything besides what he had. Which either meant he was the most contented man alive, or he'd buried it so deep it had no way out." He paused. "I don't know which one it was. I'd never asked. By the time I thought to ask, he was gone." He looked at the notebook page. "That's what the song is about. The long way down being, I don't know, choosing the safe road, and then arriving at the end of it." George Strait was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sing it." Clay looked at him. "I'd ask you to play it, but you didn't bring a guitar." He held out his own. Clay looked at the guitar. He looked at George Strait. He thought about the 40 feet of air between him and the street on Tuesday. The way singing on the scaffold didn't cost him anything because there was nobody down there to hear him, and then suddenly there was, and the world had tilted. He took the guitar. He hadn't held a guitar not in years. His hands found the neck with a muscle memory of something that never fully leaves. The way swimming or riding a bicycle never fully leave. Your body holding onto things your mind has stopped tending to. He adjusted his grip, found a position that felt right, played a slow G chord and let the string ring, and the ring of it did something to the air on that porch in Belle Mead, some small but absolute change in the quality of the afternoon. He played through the progression once, slowly, finding where the song lived. And then he sang it. His voice came out rough and careful at first, the way it always did when he was conscious of being heard. But the song was good. He could feel that again now, holding it, the way you feel the rightness of a well-made thing when it's in your hands, and the song pulled him forward into it, and by the second verse, The roughness was less about nerves and more about authenticity. And by the chorus, he was singing the way he'd been singing on the scaffold, which was to say the way a man sings when he is not performing, but simply being true to something that needs to be true. He finished. The last chord hung in the October air, and the cedar tree moved, and somewhere in the yard, something a bird, maybe one of the last ones before the migration, made a small sound and went quiet. George Strait hadn't moved. That, he said, after a moment, is a real song. Clay looked at his own hands on the guitar neck. It's 25 years old. Good songs don't expire. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Who else has heard that? No one. Just you. George Strait nodded slowly. Play me another one. They were on the porch for 3 hours. Clay played 7 songs. Not all of them were finished. Some existed only as first verses and choruses, the rest implied rather than written. But the ones that were finished were genuinely finished, with the solid architecture of songs that had been worked on and reworked and pushed until they stood on their own. And by the time the afternoon light had gone, amber and the shadows of the cedar trees had stretched long across the lawn. George Strait had a legal pad on his knee with notes on it, and Clay Harmon's hands were slightly sore in the specific way that hands get sore when they do something they haven't done in a long time. And neither man had said anything for 5 or 10 minutes. What are you doing with these? George Strait asked. Clay shrugged. Nothing. That's not an option anymore. Clay looked at him. I'm 48. I lay brick for a living. I'm not talking about making you a recording artist. George Strait said, with a patience that made clear he had anticipated this objection. I'm talking about these songs existing in the world rather than in a box on Gallatin Pike. He set the legal pad on the side table between them. I know a man in Nashville. Bobby Carver works for a music publishing company on Music Row. Good man. He signed songwriters. Clay was quiet. Songwriters, George Strait repeated with emphasis. Not performers, necessarily, though you've got the voice for it. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. You wrote 7 songs this afternoon that I would have been proud to record. One of them I want to ask you about, more seriously. If you're willing. Clay looked at his hands. The guitar lay across his lap like a sleeping thing. I have a job, he said. Not as an objection, almost as information telling himself something, reminding himself of the shape of his life. I know you do, George Strait said. He leaned forward slightly. What I'm saying to you is, you have more than that. You've got notebooks full of more than that. He let the silence have a moment. What do you think your dad would have said? If someone came to him and said, Henry, you have something we need, and it's been in a box for 25 years. Clay felt the sentence land. He didn't answer it, but he felt it land. Bobby Carver, he said finally. How do I reach him? George Strait smiled. A real one. Fuller than the controlled version he usually deployed. I already texted him about you. Clay stared at him. I did it Wednesday, George Strait said. I figured you'd come Saturday. Bobby Carver's office was on Music Row in a building that looked, from the outside, like a converted Victorian house that had made several compromises with commercial reality over the decades and arrived at a kind of pragmatic charm. The bones of something gracious, wearing the practical coat of something professional. Inside, it smelled like coffee and paper, and the specific staleness of a place where things were always in various states of completion. The receptionist, a young woman named Dana, who wore her efficiency the way some people wear their personality, as the outermost visible layer of themselves, told Clay that Bobby would be with him in 10 minutes and brought him a coffee without being asked, which Clay took as a good sign about the general culture of the place. Bobby Carver was 61, heavy, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and the manner of a man who had heard 10,000 songs in his professional life and still believed, with genuine conviction, that the next one might be the best of them. He'd been in music publishing for 30 years, had worked with writers whose names were on records Clay had grown up with, and wore his experience the way men wear good boots, thoroughly broken in. shaped to the specific contours of his actual life. Useful rather than decorative, he shook Clay's hand with both of his, which was a thing Clay was not accustomed to, but which felt, coming from Bobby Carver, entirely natural. George says you've got a notebook full of songs. Several notebooks, Clay said. Bobby's eyes went bright. Sit. Doe. What followed was the most unusual, professional meeting of Clay Harmon's life, which was not a high bar, given that his professional life had primarily consisted of meetings about load-bearing capacities and mortar mixed race. Bobby asked Clay to play 3 songs. He had a guitar on a stand in the corner of his office, which Clay took as either a professional habit or a statement about what kind of office this was, and listened with the focused stillness of a man for whom listening was not passive. He took no notes. He watched Clay's face while Clay sang, which Clay found both uncomfortable and somehow appropriate. After the 3rd song, Bobby sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for 15 seconds. Then he looked at Clay. "I want to talk to you about a publishing deal," he said. Clay put the guitar back on the stand with careful hands. "I don't know what that means." "Exactly. It means," Bobby said, pulling his reading glasses down to his eyes and opening a folder on his desk, "that we represent your songs. We work to get them placed with artists who are recording with film and TV, with whoever needs a great song and doesn't know yet that you wrote it." He looked at Clay over the glasses. "You write the songs. We find them homes. And the songs I've already written, especially those." Bobby put the folder down and leaned forward. "George played me a voice memo he recorded on his phone on Saturday, The Long Way Down. Clay, I've been in this business for 30 years. That song, I want to make a call about that song today. There's an artist recording right now who has a hole in his record. That song would feel like it was always meant to be there." Clay was quiet for a moment. "Who?" Bobby told him. Clay recognized the name. A younger country artist, early 30s, 3 records in, the kind of genuine talent that had made it through the commercial machinery of country radio without being flattened by it. He'd want to record it, Clay said. It wasn't quite a question. "He would if I play it to him," Bobby said, "which I'd like your permission to do." Clay looked at the window. Outside, Music Row went about its business, a woman walking quickly, with a portfolio under her arm, a delivery van double-parked. The ordinary texture of the street where extraordinary things sometimes happened, and ordinary things happen much more often. "There's something else," Bobby said, in the careful voice of a man who is about to deliver information he's not sure will be welcome. He folded his hands on the desk. "George mentioned you had a falling out with a business partner. Years ago, Dunny Kowalski Clay went still." He mentioned that. He did. "I know, Danny. Clay. Not well. But I know him." Bobby's voice was measured. "He's been in and out of the music business over the years. Manager for a few minor acts, some production work. He's currently managing a small label out of East Nashville." He paused. "When I called George back on Wednesday to talk about you, Danny Kowalski's name came up in a way that I think you should know about." Clay's hands were flat on his thighs. "How?" "One of his current acts, a songwriter named Jeff Holloway, has been recording demos. Some of those demos have a sound that's..." Bobby chose his word, familiar. "To anyone who heard your early work." He opened a drawer and slid a thumb drive across the desk. "George had a contact. Send those to me. I'm not making accusations. I'm telling you that before we proceed, you need to hear those demos." Clay picked up the thumb drive. It was small and light and felt, somehow, like an unexploded thing. "You think Danny Kowalski has been using my songs?" he said. "Not a question." "I think Danny Kowalski might have had access to materials from your time as partners," Bobby said carefully. "And I think the line between influenced by and derived from might be worth a legal conversation." Clay set the thumb drive on the desk and looked at it. He thought about the 6 months after the business had collapsed, when he'd moved 3 times in rapid succession and lost track of a lot of things. He thought about a filing cabinet he'd left in the storage unit that Danny had controlled, where he'd kept, among other things, cassette tapes, notebooks, early recordings. He'd eventually gotten most of it back. Most of it. "I want to hear the demos," he said. Bobby nodded. "There's a laptop in the conference room. The demos were good." That was the first disorienting thing. They were genuinely good. And Clay sat in Bobby Carver's conference room with the laptop open and headphones on and listened to a voice he didn't know, singing well-crafted songs with a specific melodic intelligence that he recognized the way you recognize your own reflection after a long time away from mirrors. Not exact, not identical. But the DNA was there. The way certain progressions turned, the way a pre-chorus built to a release, the particular placing of emotional weight at the end of a line rather than in its middle. The third demo hit him fully, a song called Borrowed Time. He'd written Borrowed Time in February of 2003, late at night, half drunk, after a fight with Carol about money and the future and the usual inventory of their unhappiness. He hadn't played it for anyone. It was in the oldest notebook, near the back. He'd looked at it on Friday night, sitting at the kitchen table, and recognized it immediately. The demo version had different lyrics, new words over what was unmistakably bone deep, unmistakably his melody. He sat there for a long time. Then he took the headphones off and went back into Bobby Carver's office. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. Bobby Carver looked at him with the steady expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had thought about it before Clay arrived. "First thing is documentation. You need to establish when your originals were created. Dated notebooks help. Early recordings help more." He paused. "Do you have the cassette tape you mentioned to George?" "Yes." "A 4-track recording from 1998, George said. 1998? I was 22. That's 28 years of documented precedent. Clay? That's significant." Bobby leaned back. "Second thing, and this is separate from the legal question, is that I want to move fast on the publishing deal. I want your work properly documented, properly registered, before any of this gets complicated. Please." Not bad. He was calm, in the way that he was always calm when a problem became concrete and actionable. The way he was calm on a job site when something went wrong. Not the absence of feeling, but the setting aside of feeling until the necessary thing was done. "There's something else," he said. Bobby waited. Danny Kowalski. He put the name down on the table between them like a stone. He knows what he has. He's had it for 20 years. He's not going to... This isn't going to be clean. "No," Bobby said. "It's probably not. He's going to say it's coincidence. Or inspiration. Or that Jeff Holloway wrote independently. Probably. And he's going to have lawyers?" "He will." Bobby nodded. "So will you." He looked at Clay steadily. "George offered to cover the initial legal costs. He wanted me to tell you that." Clay was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not," he started. "He knew you'd say that," Bobby said. He said to tell you. "It's not charity." He said to tell you he's protecting an investment because the long way down is going on a record with his name on it, and he wants clean title to what he's putting his name on. Clay looked at the window. He thought about a cardboard box beside a bed on Gallatin Pike. He thought about his father at a machine shop in Tulsa, and the question that never got asked. He thought about a green light on Demon Brune Street and a truck that didn't move. "Okay," he said. Bobby Carver nodded. "Good." He picked up his phone. "I'm going to make some calls." He called Pete from the parking lot. Pete answered immediately, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant Pete Alvarez understood the weight of this particular Saturday afternoon more clearly than he'd let on. "Well?" Pete said. "He wants to sign the songs," Clay said. "Publishing deal, and there's something with Danny." Silence. Then Kowalski. "He may have had materials from the storage unit. Songs, melody." Clay leaned against the truck. "Someone's been recording demos." The silence from Pete was the particular kind that meant he was controlling something. "I knew," he said after a moment. Clay went still. "What?" "I'd heard something, a rumor." about 8 months ago, from a guy who does electrical work over on Charlotte Avenue. He mentioned a songwriter who was making noise. Said the sound reminded him of... Pete stopped. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't want to tell you about a rumor.
Pete? I know. His voice was tight. I know, Clay. I'm sorry. Clay closed his eyes and pressed the back of his head against the truck's rear window and held the phone and breathed. There was a moment where he wanted to be angry at Pete, and the moment passed, leaving behind it something more complicated. The understanding that Pete had been protecting him in the imperfect way that people protect each other when they don't know whether information is a gift or a weapon.
It's okay, he said, and meant it. Mostly. What happens now? Lawyers, Clay said. And apparently I'm a songwriter. He could hear Pete working very hard not to say, I told you so, and winning by the narrowest possible margin. Out by dinner, Pete said. Where are you? Music Row. There's a place on 8th that does just come get me, Clay said. I'll be out front.
The lawyer's name was James Whitfield, and he had an office on 2nd Avenue in a manner that reminded Clay of a man who had long ago reached an understanding with the unpredictability of human behavior, and now met it with something between professional empathy and careful detachment. He was 45, slim, with the focused attentiveness of someone who asked questions for a living, and had trained himself to listen to answers rather than to the next question he planned to ask. He reviewed the notebooks. He listened to the 1998 cassette recording, transferred now to digital. Bobby Carver had a sound engineer do it in an afternoon. With the headphones on and the expression of a man performing an evaluation, he listened to the demos from Danny Kowalski's artist, and his expression during the third demo, the one with borrowed time-esque melody, shifted in a small but unmistakable way. This is manageable, he said. The key is precedence, and your precedence is strong. The cassette recording alone establishes 1998 as your creative origin point. The notebooks support that if we get the songs registered now, we have a clean chain. What about Kowalski? Clay asked. James Whitfield laced his fingers on the desk. Mr. Kowalski's position, if he has one, will likely be that the songs were developed independently, or that your original materials, if he had access to them, were used only as inspiration rather than... That's a conversation we'll need to have with him or with his attorneys. He paused. My recommendation is that we reach out to him before we take any formal action. Sometimes these situations resolve more efficiently when the parties understand what the other party has. He'll know what I have, Clay said. He knows what was in that storage unit. Then he'll know the landscape, James Whitfield said, and he'll calculate accordingly. The call came before Clay had a chance to make one himself. It was a Tuesday evening, 12 days after the meeting with Bobby Carver, and Clay was at the kitchen table with his own guitar. He'd taken it out of the closet where it had lived for years, tuned it, played it for an hour that first night and every night since, which was something he was not examining too closely, working through a new lyric he'd started on the site that afternoon, when his phone rang and the name on the screen was one he hadn't seen in years, Donnie Kowalski. He let it ring twice. Then he picked up Denny. He said, Clay? The voice was the same, a little older, carrying more weight somehow, but the underlying quality unchanged, which was a kind of reflexive confidence. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime believing that he was the most capable person in any given room. I heard you've been talking to people. I've been talking to people, Clay confirmed Bobby Carver, among others. Ah, Pausi. Clay could hear something in the background music, low, a bar or a restaurant. I think we should talk, Danny said. In person. There's things that... They think there are things you don't have the full picture on. I'm pretty sure I have a fairly complete picture. Danny, you have a picture, Danny said, in the careful voice of a man choosing between several approaches, but there are some parts of it that might look different if you heard my side. Another pause. I'm in Nashville. I can come to you. Clay looked at the guitar across his knees. He thought about what James Whitfield had said. Sometimes these situations resolve more efficiently when the parties understand what the other party has.
He thought about 20 years. He thought about a cassette tape from 1998 and a melody that had appeared in a demo he'd heard in a conference room on Music Row. He thought about what it would mean, at 48, to let this particular thing go back into the box. "Thursday," Clay said. "7 o'clock. There's a diner on Gallatin Pike called Margaret's. You know it?" "I'll find it. Bring your attorney if you want," Clay said. "I won't, but I don't mind." The pause was thoughtful. "Just us," Danny said, "like the old days." Clay said nothing to that and hung up. He called Renee that night. She picked up on the second ring, which was new, and said, "Hey, Dad," in a voice that was slightly different from the careful voice, slightly warmer, as if the last conversation had shifted something between them by a small but real degree. "The way you move a stone and discover the ground underneath is softer than you expected. You know a man named Danny Kowalski?" she said, before he finished explaining. "Not a question. How Mom used to talk about him when I was little." Her voice was careful now, but differently careful, protective, which he hadn't heard from her in a long time. "She said he was the reason you stopped playing music." Clay was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your father stopped playing music because of a man named Danny Kowalski, and your father has never been the same." A pause. "I was maybe 8. I didn't fully understand it then. Do you now?" "More now." She was quiet for a moment. "Dad, are you okay?" The question was simple, and the answer complicated. But the fact of being asked was, he sat with it for a moment before responding. "I think I'm going to be," he said. "For the first time in a while, I actually think I am." He heard her exhale. Not quite a sigh, something more like relief, the careful kind, the kind that doesn't want to be wrong about itself. "Call me after Thursday," she said. "Okay?" "Okay," he said. Margaret's Diner was open late and had the worn, reliable quality of a place that had been feeding the same neighborhood for 20 years and had long ago stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Clay got there at 6:45 and ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window and watched the parking lot until a rental car pulled in and a man he hadn't seen in 15 years got out of it. Danny Kowalski was 62 now. He'd gained weight and lost hair and grown the kind of groomed silver beard that men adopt when they want to look intentional about the things they can no longer control. He wore a jacket that was expensive in a way that announced itself, and he walked across the parking lot with a particular gait of a man who has decided somewhere along the way that confidence and certainty are the same thing. He came in, spotted Clay, and slid into the booth across from him without ceremony. "You look good," Danny said. "You look like Nashville agreed with you," Clay said, which was neither a compliment nor its opposite. The waitress came. Danny ordered coffee. When she left, he put both hands flat on the table and looked at Clay with the expression of a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and was now choosing among them in real time. "I want to be straight with you," Danny said. "That would be a change," Clay said, without heat, flatly, as a statement of record. Danny absorbed that. "I know what you think happened. With the business? I don't think anything happened with the business, Danny. I know what happened." James Whitfield spent an afternoon with the financials and confirmed what I already knew. Clay wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You moved money. For 6 years, you moved money out of the joint accounts into accounts I didn't have access to. By the time I figured it out, there was nothing left to figure out." Danny's jaw tightened slightly. "It was more complicated than I know it was complicated," Clay said. "I was there. I lived through the complicated part." He looked at the man across from him. "I'm not here to relitigate the business, Danny. That ship has been at the bottom of the ocean for 20 years. I'm here to talk about the songs." Danny was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee when it arrived and held it without drinking. "Jeff Holloway is a talented kid," he said finally. 27 years old. He's been writing for 5 years. He's been writing his own songs for 5 years, Clay said. "And he's been recording my melodies. That's a borrowed time," Clay said. "The verse, melody, The pre-chorus, that's mine. I have a cassette recording from 1998. I have the notebook page with a date. He leaned forward slightly.
You had a filing cabinet, Danny, in the storage unit on Thompson Lane. I got most of it back when you cleared out. I didn't get all of it. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man calculating. I'm not looking to destroy Jeff Holloway, Clay said. I don't have a problem with Jeff Holloway. He's 27, and he probably doesn't know where some of what he's working with came from. He kept his voice level. I'm looking to have what's mine. Be mine!
The songs get registered under my name. The melody credit goes where it belongs. And Jeff Holloway and I work out something fair going forward. If there's a going forward, Danny looked at him. And if I don't agree, then James Whitfield makes calls that Bobby Carver supports and George Strait's people underwrite, and it gets settled the expensive public way. Clay picked up his coffee, which I don't want. Not because I'd lose, I wouldn't, but because it takes time and energy I'd rather put into writing. Something shifted in Danny Kowalski's face. It moved through several expressions in the space of a few seconds. The careful businessman's face, the defensive face, and then something older and less managed, something that looked almost in the dynamite, like the face of a man who has carried a particular weight for a long time and found that weight exhausting. I always knew you were the better writer, Danny said quietly. It was such an unexpected thing to say that Clay didn't have an immediate response. Back then, Danny continued, when we were partners. I used to hear you playing in the shop sometimes, after hours, when you thought no one was there. And I thought, he stopped. Looked at his coffee cup. I thought, this guy has something I'll never have. And I hated him a little bit for it. He looked up. That's not an excuse. I know it's not.
Clay looked at the man across from him. He thought about what it cost to say a thing like that. Even now, even too late, he thought about the photograph of himself at 23 with a wide-open grin, and about his father at the machine shop in Tulsa who never said what he wanted, and about a daughter in Memphis who had started answering on the second ring. I know it's not, he said, but I appreciate it anyway. Danny Kowalski nodded once. He picked up his coffee and finally drank.
I'll call my attorney tonight, he said. We'll sort out the credits. On the filing cabinet, I have what's left of it. I'll have it shipped to you. Clay said nothing for a moment. Then he said, thank you. They sat in the diner for another 20 minutes and talked about almost nothing. The city, how it had changed. A restaurant that used to be on Gallatin Pike and wasn't anymore. The things that men talk about when they have finished talking about the hard thing and need somewhere neutral to stand for a while before they go back to their separate lives. When Danny left, Clay sat alone in the booth for a few minutes, watching the parking lot, watching the rental car pull out and turn onto the street and disappear. Then he paid for his coffee and Danny's and drove home.
The recording session was booked for a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after Margaret's Diner, in a studio on Music Row that smelled like coffee and treated, acoustic panels, and the productive tension of a place where things were made.
The artist, whose name was Tyler Brandt, 31, with the slightly disbelieving gratitude of a man who understood that good fortune, when it arrives, shall be acknowledged, shook Clay's hand in the hallway and said that The Long Way Down was the best song he'd been handed in 3 years of recording, and said it with the direct simplicity of someone who wasn't trying to manage Clay's feelings, just telling him a true thing. Clay said thank you, and meant it in a way that took considerable internal management to keep contained. Bobby Carver was there, in the control room, coffee in hand, reading glasses on his forehead, watching the session through the glass, with the expression of a man attending something he'd been waiting for. George Strait was not there. He'd gone back to Texas the week before, but he'd sent a text that morning that said simply, tell me how it goes. I'll be listening when it comes out.
Clay sat in the control room during the session, in a chair near the back, and listened to a 20-year-old song come alive under someone else's hands. Tyler Brandt sang it straight, with the economy and respect of a man who understood that the song didn't need to be improved, only served. The studio musicians, a guitarist, A pedal steel player who had the contemplative manner of someone engaged in a form of prayer fielded Ao Chi with the instinctive restraint of people who are very good at their work. On the third take, during the final chorus, Clay Harmon put his hand over his mouth and pressed it there and stared at the acoustic panel on the wall across from him and breathed carefully through his nose. Bobby Carver, sitting 2 chairs away, did not look at him.
He just reached over and briefly put his hand on Clay's shoulder and then took it away. He drove to Memphis the last weekend of November. He called Renee the Tuesday before and told her he wanted to come. And there had been a pause, not the careful pause, not the weighted one, just a normal pause. A person reorganizing their weekend. And she said, okay, she'd make dinner Saturday. And he said he didn't want her to go to any trouble. And she said it wasn't any trouble, which he understood to mean that it was some trouble, and she was willing to go to it, which was different. The drive from Nashville to Memphis was about 3 hours on I-40 West, through the flat middle ground of Tennessee, the landscape getting steadily more open and elemental, the sky going wide and gray over the cotton fields. Clay drove with the radio on. Country, because of course, because what else? And thought about everything and tried not to think about everything at the same time, which was something he had more practice with than he would have preferred.
Renee lived in a neighborhood in Midtown Memphis, in a house that was smaller than he'd imagined and somehow more real because of that. A brick bungalow on a street with old trees, a small front porch with 1 chair and a plant, a car in the driveway he didn't recognize. She was at the door before he knocked, which meant she'd heard the truck, which meant she'd been listening for it. She was taller than he remembered, which was impossible. She'd stopped growing years ago. But she looked it, standing in the doorway, in a dark sweater and jeans, with Carol's eyes and something around the jaw that was unmistakably his. And she looked at him for a moment without speaking. And then she said, "You're early." "Traffic was light," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in. The dinner was pasta, simple and good.
They sat at a small table in the kitchen, the 2 of them, with a glass of wine each, and talked. Really talked. Not the 5-minute nothing of recent years, but talked the way people talk when they decided that the cost of not talking is higher than the discomfort of talking, which is a calculation that takes different people different amounts of time to make.
She told him about her job, the budget process, the particular challenges of running administration in a hospital, where clinical needs and financial realities were in constant negotiation. The way she'd learned to argue for things by speaking the language of the people she was arguing with rather than the language she'd arrived with. He recognized listening to her, the intelligence of it, the strategic intelligence, the emotional intelligence, the patience with complexity.
He recognized it because some of it came from Carol, who had always been smarter about people than she'd been given credit for. And some of it came from something else entirely, something that was simply Renee. He told her about the songs, all of it. Bobby Carver, the publishing deal, Tyler Brandt, and the recording session. He told her about Danny Kowalski in the diner and the conversation that had ended the way it ended. And she listened with the expression of someone filing away a revision to a story they'd been telling themselves for a long time. "Mom's gonna be glad about that," she said, when he finished the Kowalski part. "She always said you let that go unresolved too long." She was right. She usually was, Renee said, without bitterness. They were quiet for a moment. Then Clay said, "I have something for you." He reached into his jacket and brought out an envelope. Inside was a thumb drive, the digital copy of the cassette tape, the 4-track recording from 1998. His voice said, "I was going to send this on your 21st birthday," he said. "I didn't." She looked at the thumb drive. She picked it up. She turned it in her fingers. "You've been holding this for 3 years. For 3 years." She looked up at him. "Why didn't you send it?" He looked at the table. The question deserved an honest answer, and the honest answer was the one that had sat in the box on the floor beside the bed along with everything else. The one he hadn't quite been ready to give until he'd spent 6 weeks sitting on porches and in conference rooms and diners finding out what he was still made of. "Because," he said, "I was ashamed, not of the music, of a distance between who I was when I made it and who I'd become since. He looked at her. And I didn't want to hand you something that showed you what I'd thrown away, because it would mean explaining why I threw it away. Renee looked at the thumb drive in her palm for a long moment. Then she looked at him, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd seen it since she was a child. The face she wore before she'd learned to be careful about what she let him see. I never needed you to be a musician, Dad, she said. I just needed you to be there. Nada. He didn't trust his voice quite enough to speak. But I'm glad you're getting it back, she said, and reached across the table and briefly put her hand over his. The way people touch the things that matter when they're not quite ready to hold them yet, and then pulled her hand back. They cleared the table together. She made coffee! They sat on the small front porch afterward. In the Memphis November, with the cold air off the Mississippi somewhere to the west, and the old trees dropping their last leaves in the streetlight. And they talked until nearly midnight about Carol, about Memphis, about a song he'd written at 25 called The Long Way Down, which she asked him to describe, lyric by lyric, in the specific way she had when she was small and wanted him to tell her a story at bedtime. The words themselves mattering less than the fact of them being said, the voice carrying them, the presence of someone who would stay until the end. He described every line. She listened to all of it. The Long Way Down came out on Tyler Brandt's album the following March. It was the 4th track, the kind of placement that means someone believes in a song but wants the record to get its legs first, and the first time. Clay heard it on the radio. He was on the scaffold on a different building on a different street. Troweling hand, 40 feet up the city, spread out around him in early spring, and the song came through the portable radio Pete had brought to the site, because Pete had known the release date and had, characteristically, said nothing about it. Just brought the radio. When the opening bars came through, Pete turned the volume up without ceremony. Clay stopped working. He held the trowel in both hands and listened to his own song in Tyler Brandt's voice, coming through a small radio on a scaffold in Nashville, Tennessee, in March. And the city went on below. A bus, a dog, a woman in a yellow raincoat. The ordinary texture of a world that continues being itself regardless of what is happening inside you. The song ended. Clay picked up his trowel and went back to work. Well, Pete said, after a moment. Yeah, Clay said. Pete turned the radio down. They worked in the good silence of men who don't need to translate things for each other. The kind of silence that is full rather than empty, that carries everything that doesn't need to be said. At noon, Clay climbed down from the scaffold and called Renee. She answered on the first ring. I heard it, she said. I was waiting for your call. What did you think? He heard her breathe. He heard the particular quality of a sound that a person makes when something has arrived that they didn't know they'd been waiting for. I think, she said, that you took the long way. But you got here. He stood on the sidewalk with the spring sun on his face and the city moving around him and his daughter's voice in his ear, and he thought, yes, I did. He had taken the long way. But he had gotten here, and here, as it turned out, was exactly where he needed to be.